Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Pando Days 24-25 Spring Project premieres. My name's Matthew Manos. I'm the head of a design firm here in Los Angeles called Very Nice, faculty at USC, and a longtime Pando maniac, and I'm your host today. Pando Days is the program that turns academic work into real-world solutions for community impact and global impact. All Pando Days premiere events follow a standard format. Each team is given 15 to 20 minutes to present summaries of their work, and then we have about a half an hour of open dialogue and Q&A from a panel of experts. These events are recorded, and then over the summer, the recordings, along with all project materials, will be posted on each team's dedicated webpage, which you can find at pandopopulous.com. The projects are then judged by a distinguished panel of specialists with honors and prizes passed out and networking opportunities galore happening at the Pando Sustainability Awards. So stay tuned for details on that. Today, we're excited to be hearing from Pepperdine University. The project is led by Chris Duran, professor in the religion department, and is titled Climate Migration and Faith. Chris is returning to Pando Days after a successful early start to the project 2 seasons ago. And personally, I love it when projects that were developed initially through Pando Days come back and we get to see their further development after having some traction. So, very exciting to see where this project stands. And Chris, I'll throw the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to lead with an introduction and then of the problem, and then explain how my team of students address that problem. Using biblical imagery, Guy Events argues that the four horsemen of the Anthropocene are likely to make the planet unlivable for billions of humans by the end of the 21st century. Fire, heat, drought, and floods are changing the ways that people live now and threaten to push the limits of human adaptation in the very near future. For example, the floods that killed thousands in Libya in 2023 were caused by a storm that was up to 50 times more likely due to climate change. As we careen our way towards a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius rise in global mean temperature by the end of the century, our ability to successfully adapt, at least in the sense of living as developed world citizens, have become accustomed to over the last 100 years or so, will become far more difficult, if not impossible. As one group of scientists has discovered, by as soon as 2070, 1 to 3 billion people may be living outside of what we typically know as the climate niche for humans, that very small range of temperatures on Earth that has served humanity well for the last 6,000 plus years. While using apocalyptic biblical literature and language is certainly effective in creating a mental landscape that is dramatic, we must acknowledge that there are more than four extreme climate consequences to concern ourselves with. In particular, we must not forget one that will likely change the physical landscape for billions of people as well, and that's sea level rise. While global mean temperature is on the rise, it is not nearly as high as it could be because of the heat being trapped by the climate gases we are putting into the atmosphere that are being put into the planet's oceans. And our oceans have stored a lot of heat over the last few hundred years. As one scientist puts it, the oceans have absorbed the heat equivalent to 7 Hiroshima atomic bombs detonating each second, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This hot water is working its way underneath some of the most notable glacial structures in the world and causing them to melt, and rapidly so. At the speed at which the ice sheets of Greenland and more importantly, those of Antarctica continue to melt will change the way that billions of people live on the Earth's coastlines and the flat areas that are often near coastlines in the habitable world. The ice sheet that is holding up the Thwaites Glacier, for example, which is roughly the size of Florida, is melting faster than we expected. The Thwaites Glacier alone contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by 10 feet across the planet. The problem is not just that this hot water is causing significant problems for these glaciers, not to mention the marine ecosystems around them, but also that the hot water expands and takes up more space than cold water, which itself causes more sea level rise. So even if all global carbon emissions were to stop today, feet of sea level rise will still happen because glaciers do not stop melting overnight. This sort of environmental change may take hundreds of years, if not longer, to adapt to. Some of the world's most historically significant cities like New York, London, Mumbai, Lagos, Shanghai, San Francisco, and others will be irreparably altered by sea level rise. But it is not just the cities themselves, it's the flat plains that are near a number of coastlines around the world. For example, the eastern seaboard of the US. Those coastlines will also be inundated by rising oceans. While the great cities of the world may garner more publicity when it comes to understanding the impacts of climate change, sea level rise is likely to make a number of low-lying island nations completely uninhabitable as early as the middle of our present century. Nations like Kiribati, the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, just to name a few, face this inevitable fate. These climate consequences will indeed force people to migrate. The UN's International Organization for Migration defines climate migration as the movement of persons or groups of persons who, predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change, are obliged to leave their habitual place of residence or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently within a state or across an international border. Just as we should be critical of economists and social commentators who contend that people move only for economic reasons, we should not be naive to think that all climate migration is reducible to a single climate-related reason. Instead, we should remember that reasons for migration are always varied, but often after someone does move, there's a reflection that lists primary factors that drove that final decision. I submit that climate consequences are in fact primary reasons for what so many of us are now calling climate migration. According to some scholars, we already live in what's called the age of migration. The 20th and 21st century have seen hundreds of millions of people already migrating around the planet. So what makes climate migration so different? The most significant reason is magnitude. We already know that climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes any current world problem like poverty, social inequality, or war worse. The World Bank, for example, suggests that in just 6 global regions around the world, there are likely to be as many as 216 million people moving within their national borders due to certain types of slow onset climate events by 2050 alone. This estimate alone eclipses the amount predicted by Norman Myers in 1995 when he proposed that the number of, quote, environmental refugees could be as high as 200 million by the middle of the 21st century when accounting for climate change. And he thought that might end up being a rather cautious estimate. The African Climate Mobility Initiative projects that the number of African internal climate migrants, meaning those that don't cross national borders, could reach 113 million by 2050. And if these estimates are anywhere near accurate, this is human migration unlike anything we've seen in the history of our species. Sadly, though, these are the more conservative estimates. Two researchers estimate that 1 billion people now occupy land less than 10 meters above current high tide lines, which will be impacted by even the most conservative estimates of sea level rise. The Peace and Economics Institute estimates that 1.2 billion people in just 31 countries are likely to be displaced by climate-related issues by 2050. Two other researchers out of Cornell suggest that the number of humans displaced by climate change is likely to be closer to 2 billion people by the end of this century, which would be like the approximate populations of China and India having to move from their current homes in just the next 75 years. While this number of people moving seems incomprehensible, it fits with the conventional scientific understanding that every 1 degree Celsius of temperature rise means that about 1 billion people will likely have to migrate. Skeptics assert that these numbers often sensationalize and highlight worst-case scenarios to attract attention and with it governmental action, which downplays the potential for climate adaptation generated by human ingenuity. I believe, however, history has shown that even our best climate models have been far too conservative in their projections. The climate and the planet is warming faster and in some ways more unpredictably rather, than we expected. We must prepare for the number of people migrating to be far higher than we would expect or perhaps even comprehend. And it is not hyperbole when Guy Evans says human movement on a scale never before seen will dominate this century and remake our world. People will have to move merely to survive. Contemporary migrants, climate migrants, and others fleeing their homes because they flee their homes because of a number of difficult situations that are unjust, whether those be related to climate change, war, or political persecution. And this is just one in type of injustice. Many scholars argue that this is not the only injustice that migrants face. They also face the injustice of the situation that most migrants find at the border of the new nation in which they are attempting to gain entry. Far too many migrant or refugee camps at international borders lack adequate sanitation, housing, medical support, psychological support, translators, along with many other problems. The basic necessities that so many developed world citizens take for granted are either not present or not prioritized for those on the outside of national borders. Two researchers detail the grim reality that the likelihood of death is much higher for those waiting at the border to enter a new country than we care to admit. They classify death at the border into three categories. They call them structural violence, suspicious deaths, and suicide. They argue that border policies are the leading cause of who lives and who dies at the border, shifting much of the blame of border deaths from individual migrants or agents of the receiving nation to the intentional and unintentional consequences of the policies of the receiving nation. These policies often define for the receiving nation which deaths count statistically and which do not. The scholars conclude this way. Ultimately, we contend many deaths of the migrants, whether in transit or in the context of coping with, quote, unlivable lives, take external policies aimed at non-arrival and internal policies at non-existent to their logical conclusion. Basically meaning we don't even know how many people are actually dying at our borders because so many world governments just don't count those folks as dignified human beings. Climate change, unfortunately, does not impact everyone in the same way. We know that it disproportionately impacts women, particularly as it exacerbates historical societal gender inequalities. For example, agriculture is a leading employment sector for many women in developing world nations. During increasingly frequent periods of drought and irregular rainfall, it is difficult for women to provide for their families. In many cases, this may put additional stress on young girls who may have once had the opportunity to attend school, but now must devote those hours to searching for water. This search may involve going further and further away from their homes, which exposes them to a potentially greater number of threats to their welfare and safety. When sudden onset events like cyclones happen, for example, women are more likely to be injured and less likely to survive due to a lack of available information, literacy, mobility, and decision-making agency. Additionally, these disasters can frequently leave families so impoverished that they are forced into terrible situations like selling their daughters into sexual slavery in order to feed the remaining family members. Extreme heat not only increases the incidence of stillborn or stillbirth children, but also the spread of vector-borne illnesses that are linked to maternal and neonatal outcomes. We also know that the rates of gender-based violence rise during and after climate-induced sudden and slow onset events in both developing and developed world. Furthermore, migration in general disproportionately impacts women. Climate migration, thus, is no different, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. For those of us in the Judeo-Christian tradition, this should remind us that unfortunately little has changed since ancient times. As the father Daniel Grudy notes, Sarah's willingness rather to go to extraordinary lengths for the couple's survival has many parallels with those migrants today who subject themselves even to sexual exploitation to preserve themselves or their families. So one of the problems that my team identified throughout this is that far too few people across the planet, and especially in the developed world, are talking about climate migration at all. Most conversation about climate migration is being done by a few humanitarian groups and an array of military analysts around the planet who are suggesting that this issue of people moving suddenly will cause some of the greatest violence perhaps we've seen in 100 years. One single short document by the Vatican in 2021 represents the only significant public effort by a Christian group to address climate migration seriously. American churches, and especially Protestant ones, just are not talking about this at all. Since Southern California is already a home to so many migrants, it stands to reason that not only are some climate migrants present in our communities now, but more are likely to come. So what's the project exactly? During the fall of 2024 semester, during the most divisive election season, at least of my lifetime, especially one where immigrants were castigated, demeaned, and threatened in Ohio as well as other places. My class of 19 students sought to prepare lesson plans and communication strategies for teaching a local church here in Malibu, California, about climate migration. There were three populations the students were tasked with addressing: high school students, college students, and older than college age adults. These are the three major demographics of the group at University Church of Christ here in Malibu. My students worked with four leaders at the University Church: the preaching minister, Eric Wilson, the college minister, Fallon Barton, the youth and family minister, Joel Foster, and one member of the church's leadership council, Bradley Griffin. My students were required to meet with them for 4 one-hour sessions in order to gain insight on the exact audience they were assigned. The lesson plan was built on them theoretically meeting to teach their group for a 1 hour time frame over 6 weeks. So 6 total hours of instruction to their given audience. The projects creatively analyzed biblical texts, religious rituals used by this particular church, and various pedagogical principles that they learned along the way to apply to their given age group. Unfortunately, the student projects were massively disrupted by the Franklin fire here in Malibu. Due to the fire coming onto campus on the night of December 9th, 2024, the university was forced to suspend and ultimately cancel final exams. This impacted my class in particular, as my students were given the option by the university to either take the grade they had in the class at that point or turn in the final to be graded. And approximately a third of my class elected not to finish their project. So that was a significant disruption to completing some of the project, but especially to finishing the part of the project that would have involved students presenting their work directly to this Pandos team. I then committed to working with a few students for a different version of that group project to be presented to Pandos, but unfortunately that was then disrupted by the Palisades fire that broke out a few days before Pepperdine's classes were to begin for the spring semester, which of course altered the lives and livelihoods of thousands of people here in the greater LA area, and thus forced our first week to be online, and then our next few weeks to be very, very emotionally challenging for our students. For example, one of my own students in the climate migration course lost her rental house and all of her personal property. So where does this go from here? At this point, this Pandas project is proceeding as I finish, in one way, is proceeding as I finish the edits on my manuscript that has been accepted for publication by Erdman's publishers, tentatively entitled Climate Exodus, Migration in the Age of the Anthropocene, which at the time of this presentation, so this morning, is the only book-length work on this topic from a Christian theological and ethical perspective. And then this summer, I will continue conversations with a national Christian nonprofit organization about using this material that my students generated as part of a learning platform or another type of educational campaign on this particular topic of climate migration. That nonprofit is run by a former student of mine, and so we've been working on some collaborations with this and attempting to move this project forward. As I come to a close, I just want to thank Eugene and the Pandos team for all their encouragement through this process, and Eugene especially, who's been significantly encouraging to me as I've dealt with two different fires as I'm dealing with this and a number of student and family issues that have come up during this project. So Eugene, thank you so much for being so encouraging through this. So I'll turn it back over to Matthew at this point.
Yeah, wonderful, Chris. Thank you for the overview and just the amount of insight from your introduction alone. I learned a lot from this. I think needless to say, the project is timely. I think the disruption that you faced just only accentuates how much this needs to be explored. So, really excited to see this project continue and to learn more as well. But for now, we got to hear from our panel. We've got about a half hour for an informal back and forth discussion about the project. How might we assess it? Where do you think this could go next? How can it impact the community now? And we have three respondents today. I'm eager to ask a question or have you ask a question or two as we go along. We've got Mary Elizabeth Moore, Jerry Gumbleton, and Anna Sklut. Mary Elizabeth is a longtime friend of Pando's with a distinguished career as author, teacher, administrator, and champion for courage. She is Dean Emerita of the School of Theology at Boston University and currently is chair of the board of directors of the Cobb Institute in Claremont, named for our own dear John Cobb. Jerry Gumbleton is with us, another longtime Pando friend who coined the phrase Pando on, which I've been saying at the end of each of these, by the way. Um, Jerry is a principal at Moran, one of the top consultancies in the world. He has served religious institutes and their ministries for over 40 years, assisting religious communities, healthcare organizations, and not-for-profits with aligning their resources to reach ambitious goals and objectives. And Anna Schlett. Anna is a senior Plant Moran consultant. She too focuses on helping religious communities with visioning formation processes and translating big ideas of religious communities into realities. So we've got a wonderful panel with us today. Mary, why don't we have you start with a question or reflection on anything that you just heard, and then we can jump to Jerry after that. Oh, and Mary Elizabeth, you are on mute.
Thank you. I'll begin with a specific question. In what ways did the tragedies that interrupted the plan enter into the plan itself and influence your thinking as well as your actions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I've had a lot of thinking about this because my editor at Erdman's actually asked me to write an epilogue, knowing that these two fires happened before I turn in the final draft in a couple of weeks. So I've struggled with it, to be perfectly honest, because this is now the fifth fire that I've been through with either a faculty member or a student at Pepperdine where I've had to evacuate, or had my car packed up ready to evacuate. There's been a few other fires, but not those closest to campus. So I think there's a sense to me of a couple of things. One, my own church and churches in this area, seeing them work with people to do fire relief has been a huge blessing and a huge sense of hope in a community like Malibu, which gets this kind of bad rap for being a bunch of wealthy people. But well, there's a lot of other non-wealthy people that live in Malibu that we are helping out on nearly a daily basis. So there's some hope in that. But there's also, a sense of despair in the sense of this seems to be happening over and over again, and political and other governmental forces don't seem to recognize the role that climate change plays in exacerbating fires, in particular in our Southern California. So I think there's that kind of tension between feeling like you're the lonely prophet, screaming from the mountaintops that this is happening for a particular reason, and those not listening to what that is because of certain kinds of political and social, backgrounds or ideologies. So I think as a person who's a Christian, I find myself really trying to minister to people who, like my students, who, are triggered now every time they smell smoke. Is this the next fire, coming to our campus? For weeks, all of our campus was around the hillsides were black around us before we got some rain. And that can be a really emotional thing for an 18 to 20-year-old. That's not the same thing as someone like me in his 40s who has to like deal, with different kinds of hopefully more mature issues than that. But still, every time I hear a helicopter, I'm looking up, wondering which way is it going? And so I think there's a lot of different kinds of pieces to this that will play out. And I think of myself with some of the social safety nets I have as a developed world citizen that are not in place for most of the developing world. And what does that mean for those people to not even have those basic things like helicopters even to fly over to drop water, or airplanes to drop water, or firefighters to protect a campus? So I'm rambling a little bit, but there's a lot of different pieces that I have as I'm wrestling with this. And it's sort of existential in the sense of like, I can't get insurance for my house any longer because of living here. That's one
Right.
existential kind of issue. But there's another piece of it is like, I know I'm better off than others. So how do I kind of help others in a community like this? And I think we're still kind of working that out.
And I'll do a follow-up, a quick follow-up. You gave some very, um, well, some daunting statistics about climate change and climate migration. Do those figures include migration due to fire, which is also related to climate change?
Yeah, yeah. So those do. I mean, those are global numbers. So they're very The demographers that I follow on this, continue to tick upwards. So they're not like set in stone kind of numbers because obviously you're dealing with a whole bunch of really complicated permutations. But what I've noticed since the 1990s when this has been modeled, not that I was modeling it, but following the history of this modeling, is the numbers only continue to go up because the better that our radar and LiDAR and other types of satellite technology get on predicting sea level rise, we're realizing there's so many people that live, like in the US, just within 20 to 30 miles of an ocean. You think about the East Coast, you think about the West Coast. The West Coast just is different because of the physics of where we're at. But if you look at the East Coast, it is so flat. And how many of the great cities of the East Coast are only, 10, 20 miles from the ocean? And, the Outer Banks of North Carolina and South Carolina and Florida, all those things are already eroding. And so you think about what that means. It's not just fires, it's fires for here. And so what I try to do with my students is when we focused with this church, for example, is to say, we're not going to be disrupted by hurricanes. We are going to be disrupted by wildfires. So we have to be very local when we talk about these kind of events. And so my idea of partnering with this nonprofit group is that they have a huge presence in the Southeast. So we'll be talking a lot more about flooding and hurricanes in the Southeast and a lot less about fires. And so kind of thinking about that in a very local way, I think is
Yeah.
the best way for us to kind of get at it. We have to deal with the global issues, but then when we get to local communities, to be very, very precise about what those kind of local challenges are.
Yeah. Thank you.
Jerry, why don't we throw it to you and then we'll go to Anna.
Thanks, Matthew. And thanks for your presentation, Chris, and the materials. Obviously a lot of research and a lot of work went into, sort of making the connection between the spiritual dimension of, being in a world and in relationship with your neighbor. And it strikes me that this conversation is at two levels. There is a sort of a direct service. So what can I do directly for my neighbor? Working in a food pantry or responding to immediate disasters. Sending money or volunteering or whatever. And then there's a systemic level, and the direct service is just putting band-aids on, kind of what we're facing. And if we're going to stem the tide of this, how do we change hearts and minds so that we can start to address the systemic issues that are associated with the whole issue of migration, in relationship to climate change. There's racism, there's sexism, there's all of that, as well as the denial of, the impact of climate change and so forth. So how do you get at the hearts and minds, so that we really start to address the more systemic issues?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just give a shameless plug for my book. I had two chapters on kind of false narratives that Americans and other Protestants around the planet tend to live by when it comes to talking about migrants. And I think that's one of the pieces of it is like we're going to have to do some real soul searching in the mirror about kind of the patriarchies and the gender inequalities and some of the other false narratives, racist narratives that we live by and we allow to exist. And individual Christians as well as Christian groups or in churches are going to have to do some real soul searching about where they stand on some of those things. So that's one piece of it. But as I think about it for how we put the project together at the local level, what I had my students do was kind of focus on the individual level because the systemic part, I think, was impossible for one church to think about as their first entry into this, but was more at the individual level. Knowing the history of this particular church is they don't do a lot of social advocacy work, but they do a lot of local work in a community. So that was the trade-off I sort of made with this project. So one of the things that we thought about in the different age groups was the students that were working with with the high schoolers and learning language to be using there, those high schoolers don't have any problem talking about climate issues. They don't have any problem talking about migrants that happen to live in their Malibu communities or their surrounding communities. They see the disparity between wealth and poor in their own high schools and their middle schools that they've come from. Um, and they've all lived through wildfire now, at least one, if not two, in just, they're 14 to 18 years on this. So making those connections was very, very important because I think what we tend to not want to do in churches is make connections between what we're seeing and what's going on inside of our own, whether we call them congregations or sanctuary spaces or what have you. And that one of the things that I force my students to do is like draw explicit connections between what we're seeing out there and what the climate modeling is or what scientists are having to say, and then what the governmental response is. And then thinking about the hearts and mind part with the migrants is to think about what narratives, again, going back to that, does this church live by that is perhaps encouraging people to come in their doors, or which ones are they not examining that is discouraging people from coming in their doors and they may not even know it? And so thinking about that, I think is an important piece because I'm sort of a heart and mind guy. I'm a theologian by training, but a scientist by college degree. So as I think through these issues, I take the science very seriously, but I'm sort of on the Martin Luther King side of things that like you change heart and minds if you're going to have social change. You can't just do it by legislation alone. And so that's my presupposition. And connecting the dots, Jerry, is how I try to get my students to do that. So whether it was the high school level, the college level, or the quote unquote adult level, was how can we connect dots with wildfires? How can we connect dots with droughts? How can we connect dots with water conservation stuff that they had to let their lawns go dry and they were really upset about it? And then connecting it with migration is often through food in California. Why is the price of food X rather than Y? Why do you think those folks that you see on the sides of the roads in Oxnard or in Ventura or some other places nearby, why do they tend to all be people of brown skin? Why are there not white folk out there doing that? Like, what are some of the things that we can talk about to connect those kind of dots?
It's to follow up on that, if I might, that comment, and then you'd mentioned something in as you were doing your introduction about, economists say that, economics causes people to move. And, it seems like, we've reduced so much of our thinking to economics that, it's all about how do we maximize profit at the expense of the common good. And if we continue to focus on, maximizing the economy, either out of a scarcity model or an abundance model, that we've created this false narrative that economics should drive everything. And if we don't change our narrative around our economic model, we'll continue to devalue the earth and through the extraction economy. And so making that connection too, that it is related to economics, as you kind of just described. So helping your students see that would probably be a
Yeah, I
good thing
mean,
too.
I appreciate you hearing that way because I think the reducibility that we often hear from political and economic commentators is that people only move for economic reasons, or if you go into kind of some of the false narratives, they only want a piece of the American or developed world existence, so they're trying to get something that we are owed ourselves. What I attempt to do, at least with my students in that class, is we watch some videos, for example, of people living in the Pacific islands of Kiribati or Vanuatu or some other places where rain is no longer falling from the sky, or the king tides are damaging the very small farm plots that they have and they've subsisted on for thousands of years. People are not looking for an export economy at that point. They're looking merely to survive. And so that's one of the narratives I think that we need to change is that why is it that in the developed world we get to say people only move for economic reasons when we see, the billions of people around the planet that are moving merely because there's either too much water falling from the sky or not enough water falling from the sky, and they're just trying to feed their families and survive. And if we were to start with that as a common, human family narrative that we all would want to survive, and maybe that gets us in a different place.
And so and maybe they are moving for economic reasons. And the economic reasons are because we are extracting, so much from the earth, and we are causing climate change to support our own economic model. And so I guess, maybe in some ways they are moving for economic reasons that we are causing.
Oh yeah,
And so
definitely. I
making that
mean,
connection.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and again, we in the class and then in my book, I talk a lot about the disproportionate burden that the global South faces because the global North tends to live the way that we do. And until we address that, I'm not sure we have a comprehensive kind of solution, if there is such a thing as a comprehensive solution, but that has to be at least addressed dramatically, as all of us, on the Zoom screen and have access to electricity regularly, live a much different lifestyle than most of the rest of the planet.
And Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Um, Chris, thank you for your presentation. Also a theologian by trade, former minister as well. So I'm curious, when we talk about sustainable involvement in faith, many people at all age levels are drawn to involvement or participation in a life of faith through acts of justice and an opportunity to make an impact. How do you see these very real circumstances as a tool for evangelization and sustainable faith? Like, where did your students find the most momentum in their lesson plans, or an in where people could maybe work toward making an impact in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Um, I would say probably about half of my students in that class would have identified as either not Christian or like seeking or searching of some sort. So there was a level of skepticism that I thought was really healthy that they brought to this project, because they were forced to learn a lot about the religious principles and rituals and such of this particular church in order to understand that. And so I think one of the connecting things that they found, hopefully this answers your question, so feel free to redirect me if it doesn't, is you have to speak to churches in language that they already have in order to get them to think about new things. You can't just sort of drop new language from on high and expect people to do that. And I think that was really good advice that was given by the four church leaders to them, is like, start with the language that we have now and then kind of think about how do you work with that as quote unquote outsiders from that. And so for the church leaders who were insiders, they said, here's where we think you can start, and here's how far we think you could go. And then, realize that unfortunately, this iterative process that can be very, very disconcerting for 18 to 22-year-olds is just how humans work. We're just not nearly as non-iterative as we like to think that we are, even if we're love to believe that we're radically progressive on something. It usually is a very stepwise process. So I think that's part of it. And then one of the things that this church has done, which is sort of fascinating, it has a 40-year relationship with what's called the Malibu Labor Exchange, which is a local group that works with documented and non-documented labor to help them find either day jobs or week jobs or month jobs. That operation was massively disrupted by the fires, because now all of a sudden places that they were doing construction, domestic labor, et cetera, were gone overnight. And now with sort of the deportation emphasis of the current federal administration, groups like that are even feeling more at threat for doing that. But what my students were able to do was sort of use that history and say, like, if your church has this history, we could start thinking about, like, where were some of the places those folks are coming from? Could they have been disrupted by climate issues, or are they currently being disrupted by climate issues? And even if the folks themselves won't admit to that or speak to you in English enough to understand that, you could start connecting the dots that, like, this is a 40 plus year historical relationship we've had with this organization, that there might be some other pieces that you can draw on a church's history to say, like, this is impacting people in a different way than we thought possible. And how do we sort of talk about it using the history of that church, rather, again, than trying to dump something new on them and saying, do something altogether novel. Does that get at your question at all, Anna?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so much of it is centered on relationship. It, there's so much about meaningful ministry that lands there. What you say about speaking the church's language, I think also very relevant. I'm just curious. It seems to me like the document Laudato Si that was put out by the Catholic Church more than 10 years ago, that seemed to be one of those documents that, like, spoke church language, but also invited a little bit of a paradigm shift in the Catholic Church, at least. I'm curious if that came up at all in any of your studies or conversations.
Yeah, so this church is a Protestant group that really prizes Scripture, and they like to say that they start from Scripture. And so while I teach Laudato Si in other classes here on campus, like that would not be the first document that this church would go to. And so what these four church leaders help my students with is like, where are the biblical texts that would be really instrumental to getting their audience to like, okay, I'm grounded, but now I can take another step. And so I think that was really helpful because for each of those audiences, the college audience, the high school audience, and then the older than college, they were all different kinds of texts that were suggested as starting points for that kind of thing. For example, as you might imagine, high schoolers and college students more likely than not to see some justice issues with climate issues. Older than college students, not necessarily looking for the justice link between climate and such, at least at this particular church. And so I think that was a really creative thing for my students to engage with, was like to make those choices. And then in their assignment for me, they had to like defend that choice. It's like, how did you pick this particular thing? How does it connect to that? You know, is it the starting place of Genesis 1? Is it the starting place of Psalm 104? Is it the starting place of, you know, something else? And getting that grounding to then ask a person to take a different step or a different read of that particular text. And as you know, in ministry, like that's oftentimes what we have to do is ask people to look at it just from a slightly different angle rather than just like word dump, you know, 3 years of our master's degree on top of them and expect them to, you know, come out the other side.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, the scriptural literacy in the lesson plans are is great and super varied, and I think that is maybe a real strength in having maybe seekers pulling together this information because those of us who grew up in a church are so used to hearing that kind of same verbatim tape, and so to have someone else say, "Okay, I see this verse. Could it mean something else?" Is, I think, a really meaningful pedagogical tool. Thanks.
Wonderful discussion so far, everybody. We've got time for maybe one more if there's one out there. Or Eugene, if you had a comment or question that you wanted to throw in the ring.
Gosh, I don't want to stop anyone else from adding more comments and, you know, uh, questioning anything. It's because it's such a rich project and rich area for discussion of all kinds. There are 1,000 things one could ask. But Chris, I think from my perspective, right, the biggest question is if you could talk just a little bit more about next step opportunities, understanding that, you know, some of those are speculative, but I think that there's a lot of potential here. And then you talked about your student, former student, launching a nonprofit to help push some of this forward. Just love to hear more about any of that, and also the role your book will play in all this and everything.
Yeah, thank you. So Avery Davis Lamb is my former student. He is the executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, which is a national faith-based creation justice group, as the title suggests. And he and I have been talking about this for a while. He did in his grad work in Duke. Um, he did some work on climate migration because he had taken some classes with me and sort of did some actual modeling of how the Southeast was going to be impacted by flooding and sea level rise and what that might mean. And so this summer we plan to spend some time together to be able to try to map out what that would look like. They've had a little bit of change in their organization, but actually it will probably strengthen the ability to take on it, something like this with some of the new folks that they have. So that's one piece of it, kind of working on that because he has a network of lots of different churches that, you know, obviously one person like myself just can't have. And so having a group of churches and a large board that operates their nonprofit from multiple different denominations, I think will give some people some opportunities to look at this kind of material and say like, where might it fit in my particular denomination or where might it fit in my particular, you know, region of the country? Because as we know, talking about climate change is different from region to region. And even as more churches are talking about it, it tends to be very region specific. So is it, you know, Tornado Alley or is it the Southeast or is it, you know, wildfires in California? Um, yeah, I'm turning in the book in a couple of weeks, regardless of whether I like it or not. I mean, I'm not at that stage, as we all know, that you just get to a point where you're tired of reading your own stuff for that long and it'll get out there. Um, as far as I know, I keep, doing the research on this. There's just, other than the Vatican's document in 2021, which was a very short piece, but a powerful one on what they called climate displaced persons, there's nothing about this in the Christian world. And that's, unfortunately, not surprising, but still a bit of despair in that, to think that we, as those of us who call ourselves Christians, are not thinking about this, particularly in the US. Climate denial, unfortunately, is back on the rise rather than going downward. So there's lots of other challenges that are out there about that. But I think Eugene, to go back to something I said to Jerry, like, I think the churches in Southern California that were hit, whether they were in Pasadena, Altadena, out here in the Palisades and Malibu area, it's not that they're connecting the dots and saying, "Oh, this must have been climate related," but they're starting to connect dots and saying, "No one came to our rescue. No one came to save us. Things move really quickly. What does that mean for the poor in our community, or the dispossessed, or the migrants in our communities that have, almost no social safety nets, in this?" And so, if this project could be a part of just connective tissue, if you will, to some of those who are starting to connect those dots and say, maybe we need to think more differently about how to use our physical spaces, or how do we need to think about, I mean, I know of a bunch of church, not a bunch, but I know of a couple of churches in my own tradition burned down, and they don't have insurance, so they won't be rebuilding. So what does that mean, to be a church without a home? Do you look to the first century kind of model? What does it mean to be in a community where you don't have a building any longer? It's not something that people have thought about for more than 100 years at least. That's been just a common American Protestant, at least, representation of what church is. So I think, Eugene, that would be something that I know I'm on the lookout for, not just in my own church community, but the churches in the greater Malibu area that I'm connected to that are still standing, is how do we use our space in ways to demonstrate, what I talk about in the book, hospitality, solidarity and courage in particular, to think about being different kind of voices here in Southern California. So that's a little bit long-winded, but does that get at what you're going?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you. But just with a follow-up on that. So when the book comes out, and now you have these study materials that students have worked on and all, is what is what is what is your vision for what's supposed to happen here? Best case. I mean, we're trying to spin out.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
think that,
will a
yeah,
church
but
get a book, and will they get a study guide, and will the church board get together and
yeah.
and
Well, I
talk
mean, if
about it?
I could
What do you
hand out
want?
church to books to all the churches, I would. That would definitely make my wife think that I was doing something really awesome. She's like, "Why can't you write the next Harry Potter?" I'm like, "That's just not quite, how it works in the theological realm." Um, I think there's a role. I mean, Erdman's has told me they think that there's a role for this for sort of theological audiences, but also for sociologists, psychologists, and political science folks. So I'm kind of interested in the multiple spaces that it might operate in, because of the way that I attempted to look at the kind of the false narratives that we live by when we talk about migrants, and what that means, not just from a Christian context, but just in a larger social sense of the kind of political moment we're in, where we sort of castigate and demean without any kind of accountability. And churches, I think, unfortunately, can be too often be a part of that. Um, to answer your question more directly, though, I really am waiting to see, what fruit comes from my conversations with Avery and his team, because they're much more equipped to understand how they have already platforms in place to educate church audiences on climate related issues. So I want to hear back from someone who's an expert on that, like, not to rebuild the wheel, but to, like, use what's in place already and add this migration piece to something that is already working in faith communities, rather than trying to start from scratch. So if you ask me in August, Eugene, I probably have a slightly different answer that's more educated, in the sense of, like, let's find some of those platforms that are already existing in those networks and use that, rather than trying to just launch out a whole nother. At least that's my initial thought.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Wonderful.
fantastic work, Chris, and team of students as well. Let them know this is really, really thoughtful work, and I appreciate all of the discussion that it generated as well. Hate to be a showstopper, but it's about that time. So first, thank you so much to the respondents, Mary, Jerry, and Anna, for your comments, questions, and insights. And Chris and Pepperdine team, thank you again for your work. Got to keep us posted on the book. That's super exciting, and can't wait to see where this goes next. Our next and last premiere is next week, Friday, June 13th at 2 p.m., and it's with UCLA. For now, thank you for joining us, and as Jerry would say, Pando on.